In this tutorial, we'll be going over the process of using your CNC in conjunction with your laser to create a customizable photo plaque. We will start with a set of pre-made vectors and walk through creating the laser toolpath for the photo that will be engraved or etched on the plaque, and then we will develop the Moulding Toolpath and VCarving toolpath that will be used to cut the rest of this project. But first we just need to close out of this, so we'll go to File, Close, and we'll start now by opening an existing file, and from the project folder we'll choose the photoplaque.crv. So we'll select that and then click Open. Now right away on the workspace in the 2D view you'll see a selection of vectors on different layers. And first of all we'll have a look at the job setup. So under File Operations we'll go to Set Job Dimensions and Origin. And we're going to be working with a single-sided job with a width of 10 inches, a height of 7 inches and a thickness of ½ inch. So our units will be in inches. We're going to be zeroing from the material surface in this case, and our XY datum position will be in the lower left-hand corner. We'll have our modelling resolution set to very high, and we'll just set the material appearance. So we'll click into Material Settings, and from the drop-down list we're going to be using Canadian Maple. And we can click Apply. And the next step is just to review our layers. So we'll go up to the Layers menu. And in here we can see that we've got 3 different layers. So we've got moulding vectors, and those are the vectors that we're going to use as drive rails for a moulding toolpath around the outside of our plaque. The next layer down we've got text, so we've got some text on its own individual layer. So this is just templated text, so we can go in and change these. So we can change the first and last name and the month, date and year for the birth of the baby that we're going to be making this for. So this is going to be a baby plaque. And then on the last layer we've got a bitmap crop layer. So this is just the circular vector in the center, and this is what we're going to use to crop the bitmap image to. And we can also view these layers within the Layers tab. So if we go into that, you can see the Moulding Vectors text and bitmap crop layers listed. But for now, we'll just go back into the Drawing tab and we'll take a look at the strategy that we're going to use to etch in the picture of the baby into the center of our plaque. So if we just flip over to the Toolpaths tab now, and you'll see the 2 laser strategies that were installed with our laser module. So we've got laser cut and fill and laser picture. Now for the purposes of this demonstration, we're not going to be covering the laser cut and fill, but there's another excellent tutorial about making the construction square or V-square that will cover that in great detail, and you can find that in the related video section on this page. But for this particular video, we're going to be looking at the laser picture strategy. So we'll click to go into that now. And this is our laser picture form, and we'll just work through this now just to give a brief overview of all the settings and parameters that we can set for our laser picture. So in the top section of the form here we've got all the settings that we'd like to use for our laser, and we can either do that by selecting the tool from the database using the select option, or we can make modifications on the fly to the max power, minimum power and move speed by using these edit boxes here. And these settings will apply temporarily for this toolpath only, without affecting the saved tool in the tool database. In the next section, we've got 3 different strategies that we can choose from. So we can choose from raster, hatch, or selected vectors. And you'll see that as we click through these, the picture at the side will change so you can visualize what pattern you're going for. We can choose to dither the image, and this will apply to the raster and the hatch strategy. You can use this technique to help create a greater variation of shades by further pixelating the image. And we have some further settings down here for each strategy. So we've got line spacing and line angle. The next part of the form down here is our Safe Z and home position. So these were set when we completed our material setup. And of course we could come down to give our toolpath a name if we wanted to. And we could choose to project our toolpath onto a 3D model. We're not going to get into that in this tutorial, but we do cover that in detail in the related picture tiger face tutorial. If we'd like to save off our toolpath from right inside this form, then we can do so by coming down and selecting the appropriate post processor from this list. But we do have a dedicated toolpath saving guide which is available as a related video, and that will cover this topic in much greater depth, so we're not going to go through that here. If we wanted to, we could also get it to amend the toolpath name with the side of the job, but as we've only got one side here, we don't need to worry about that. And we can also choose to output direct to machine using V-transfer if our CNC has that capability. And then we can save our toolpaths and then calculate and close down this form. So that was just an overview, so we'll close down the form for now. And now we need to look at bringing in a bitmap that we're going to place in the center of our plaque. So let's go back over to the drawing tab. So we're going to jump back over here, and we can either use the import function under file operations, or we can go to file, come down to import and choose import bitmap from the list. And you'll see also included in the tutorial folder, we've got this baby JPEG. So we'll select that and then click open. And that will be imported directly into the middle of our job. And by doing that, if we just go up to the layers menu, we can see that a new layer called bitmap layer has been created, that's now been placed on. And we can turn off and on the visibility of that. But for this demonstration, we're going to leave that on. And now what we need to do is resize this bitmap because it's a bit small at the moment. So we'll double click on that to put that into transform mode. And then we'll bring the cursor over to the top corner, and holding down shift, we can then scale that up. So we'll place it about roughly there, and grabbing the center point, we can click and hold the left mouse button and just drag that down. And what we're looking to do is just fill up this center circle vector with the baby's face. So we can just drag that around, resize it again, just drag that down so it's central to the circle, as close as we can get. And we can also use the directional keys on the keyboard to nudge that around, just make it a bit bigger. Size it up a bit more, drag it down, and that looks good right about there, so that's great. Now we're going to use this orange circular vector to crop this bitmap to, because we're only going to want to laser the area that's within this. So to do that, we're going to make sure that we've got our bitmap selected, and it is currently selected, and then holding down the shift key, we're going to select the circle as well. So the first selection is the image that we're cropping, and the second selection is the vector that we're going to crop that to. So then we can come over to Edit Objects, and on the third row down, over on the right, we can use this option to crop bitmap. And if we then left click on that, you'll see that our bitmap has now been cropped to that circle. And we can select that again just to check it, and that looks pretty good. The next thing that we're going to want to do is look at changing the contrast, maybe the brightness of this image, so that we can get a better reproduction of this when we use our laser. And to do that, we're going to use our picture editor under Edit Objects. So we'll click to go into that. And in this form, we've got a few editing tools that we can use to change this picture. So we can use the sliders here to change the contrast. And if you wanted to set that back to default, you can just click on the notch in the center and that will centralize it again. And we can change the brightness if we'd like to. And also the gamma. And we've got some further options here. So we can choose to invert that image into a negative if we wanted to. And we've got a grayscale. And we can choose to add a border to our image. So we can choose a rectangular border, but that wouldn't work very well with the shape of our photo. So we can also choose an oval border, and we can change the width of the border here. So choose how far in it's going to fade out the image around the edges. So I only want a slight fade out here, so move that over slightly, just so that we haven't got too much of a hard border where the laser picture ends. And that's looking pretty good there. So we've kept most of the image in, but it just means that our laser engraving won't have a hard edge to it. Now, with the image in colour, it's a bit difficult to visualise how this is going to look as a laser engraving. So to help me with that, I'm going to actually convert this image to grayscale. And that just gives me a bit more of an idea how it's going to look on the finished part. And we'll just take a second just to look over this image. So first thing that you'll notice is there's not that much variation in the tone. So for instance, we've got very similar shades across the top of the head here, and that might not make for a very detailed engraving. So we can have a look at adding in a bit more depth to the tone here by using these controls. And the first thing I'm going to try is just increasing the contrast slightly. So I'll just move that up in increments just until we think it looks a little bit more detailed in that grayscale. So somewhere around here is looking pretty good. And we can increase the brightness a little bit as well. Just lower that slightly. So that's looking pretty good. So you can see some of the bright spots on the face are starting to pop out now against the darker parts of the image. So we've got a much greater depth of tone there, so a lot more variation between the grayscale. And maybe in doing that, it may be a little bit light in these areas, so it could look a little bit washed out, but I'm not too worried about that at this stage because we can always etch over it again. So just burn that in again and make it darker if I wanted. So I'm pretty happy with that there. So we can click apply to commit those changes and then close out of the form. And now we've got our bitmap image that we're going to apply it to, we can go back over into the toolpaths form and take a closer look at our laser picture toolpath. So the first thing that we need to do is choose the appropriate settings for our laser. And we're going to be cutting this in hardwood. So we're going to go ahead and choose the settings that we've tried and tested previously that we think will be a good starting point for etching in hardwood. So I'll click select now to go into the tool database. And the first thing that you'll notice is the material drop down here. So we've currently got plywood selected. So we just click on that to open the list. We can see various different materials that we can choose from, but we're going to go for hardwood. And here we can see all the laser tools that we imported with the laser module. So we'll just have a look at these. We're not going to choose the first option here because that's just for marking the top of our material. So just for small numbers or tick marks. And instead, we're going to use the settings for a picture. And the parameters here will just vary slightly between the two. So our kerf is set differently and our power, and also the move speed and the maximum burn rate. And this is set so just so that we get a pretty close representation of what we'll see in our material reflected in our 3D toolpath preview in the software. Again, if you'd like further information on how to set up the laser tools here, then we do go into this in much more depth in the related V-square laser tutorial. So you can get some good pointers of how to actually set these up from that video. But for now, I'm happy with this, so I'll click select to choose that tool. And again, we can use the edit option if we wanted to just temporarily edit the settings for this tool just to apply to this toolpath. But they're okay in this case, so I can just click OK. And then we've got these three settings, max power, minimum power, and move speed, that we can change on the fly. So maybe I'll put the max power on 50%, move speed I'll probably put to 20 millimeters per minute. And with that done, we can move down to have a look at the strategy settings. And the first one that we have on our list is Raster. So Raster will create a single set of parallel lines or stripes across the image. And with that selected, I can choose how dense I'd like the lines to be, so the line spacing, and also the angle that the lines are going to be at. And I can also choose to dither the image. And with that unchecked, the laser power will be changed evenly in response to the darker and lighter areas of my image. And that will give us a really nice tonal burn into the material of the image that we apply it to. And this can lead to fantastic results on some materials, but may not work as well on others. So for those, you can choose to dither. And this will generate a tonal range using only black dot patterns of different densities. So this is kind of like a newspaper print effect. So you'll have darker areas where you've got a greater concentration of black dots and lighter areas where they're further apart. And as I said, for some materials, this is definitely the better option to use. So you'll just have to try the both just to decide which the best option to use for the material you're working with is. And we can have a look at the differences between those in just a second, but if we stick with Raster for now, we can use these sliders down here to change the density of our lines, so the line spacing and the angle of the lines. We have our safe Z and home positions, which comes from the material setup that we selected in the job setup form. We can come down and give this a name, so we'll just call this picture. And we don't want to save the toolpaths directly from this form, so we can click calculate. And the software's throwing up a warning that we haven't got the bitmap selected, so that's being deselected. So we just need to click to select that again, and then click calculate. And once that's done, the software will open automatically into the preview, and we can see our toolpath here. So if we zoom in really close into that, you can see our horizontal parallel lines going straight across because I didn't have any angle on the raster. And that's looking pretty good. So you can see the baby's face there. So the editing that we did to the bitmap seems to have worked. And with that, we can go and preview that. And that's looking pretty nice there. But we're going to have a look at some of the other options. So we'll just reset that preview. And we're going to click on our toolpath again in the list to open that again. And we're going to look at switching on Dither. So we'll click select. And we're going to apply it to the raster again so we can compare the two. And we'll just come down and click calculate again. And now you can see the difference between the divot appearance. So we'll click to preview again. And you can see that we've got a different appearance now with the black dots, but I think that'll still look pretty nice in that material. And now we can go back in and have a look at the hatch strategy as well. So we'll reset that again, go back into the toolpath and pick hatch. And we'll switch off Dither for now and recalculate. And you can see with that, we've got a kind of grid type pattern in that, which will be very densely detailed, and it may even be darker. So we'll just preview that again. And just as expected, it is quite dense and a lot darker than the Raster version. But we'll just switch the toolpath back on and we'll zoom in to have a look. There you go, you'll see that these are actually squares instead. So we'll switch that back off again, reset the preview, and we'll go back in to have a look at another one. And this time we'll use the hatch again, but we'll switch on Dither and recalculate, and we'll have a look at that one. And you can see there that it's a different effect to the Dither on the Raster, but that's still looking pretty nice, I think, in that material. Okay, so we'll reset that again, and this time we'll have a look at the last option, selected vectors. So if we choose that there, and what this is going to allow us to do is use a set of selected vectors as the pattern for our etching. But as we don't have any vectors to base this off yet, we need to either create them or import them. So to do that, we'll go over to the drawing tab again, and we'll just switch over to the 2D view for a second. And we're going to have a look at this circle as the boundary of our laser picture, because we don't want the vectors to spill out over into the rest of the design. So we're going to select that, and we're going to go into vector texture. So we're going to create a vector texture within this circle. And in the form, you'll see a lot of different parameters for changing the various different aspects of the vector texture that you're creating. But we're not going to go through this in depth now. We do have a great tutorial on this called Vector Texture Drawing, which we'll include in the related video section on this page. So if you wanted to learn more about the Create Vector Texture tool, then I'd recommend having a look at that. But for right now, we're going to stay with an angle of 0, and we're going to use a maximum spacing of our lines of 0.03 inches. Our amplitude is going to be 0.5 of an inch. Our wavelength we're going to leave at 2.5, and we're not going to add any noise in here. And we're going to create a new layer to place this on separately by checking place vectors on layer, and we'll just call that vector texture. And we're just going to preview that. And I can see now by previewing that quickly that we've got way too much variation in the lines here. So I'm just going to put variation to 0 also, preview it again. And that's now going to give me a much more uniform etching with the equal line space in between each vector. So if we quickly zoom in on this whilst we're previewing, we'll see that the texture that we've created is actually a set of wavy lines. And if we wanted, we could make edits here, re-preview, and then check over them before we commit them. So we could change the max spacing to, say, 0.5 and re-preview that. And you'll see that the spaces between the vectors gets larger. And just to have a look to see what the variation does here, you'll see that we'll then get varying line spacing between each vector. I'll just put that back. And we can change the amplitude of the wavelength if we wanted to. So I'll just preview that. And you'll see that we've just got much tighter, steeper waves there. And we can change the wavelength itself, so we can make it longer or shorter. So I'll just preview that. And shorter. Really tight, steep waves there. And I'll just put this back to 0.5. And the wavelength put to 1.3. And the noise, this will just break up these smooth curves into jagged single lines. So if we just introduce some here just to demo that, you'll see that we've then got these really rough, noisy lines instead of smooth curves. But we're not going to look to add any of that in there. So just go back. And I'm happy with how that looks in the preview now. So I can click OK to commit that. And we can go back over to the Toolpaths tab now to use this with our laser picture strategy. And to do this, we're going to need both the bitmap and the vectors selected for the texture. So we'll just zoom in a little bit so that we can get between the lines to select the bitmap. Then holding down Shift, we'll also select the vector texture. So we've got the bitmap selected that we're going to apply it to, and we've also got the vectors that we're going to use as the selection for this selected vector strategy. So we can come down and click calculate, and you can see now that the lines that are going to be laser etched to represent this bitmap image are now based on the vectors that we created for the vector texture. And we can come over and preview that. And if we zoom in on the preview, we can see now how the etching has followed these vectors, and it's given us a really interesting effect here, but still representing the bitmap that we based it on. So it's quite a subtle effect there, but if you wanted to, you could tighten that up and increase the density by using a lesser line spacing. But also to darken this up as well, because it is looking quite washed out at the moment, we can simulate what would happen if we were to burn this twice. So if we press preview all toolpaths again with just that selected, you'll see that that's now darkened up. So that's the effect of burning this image twice into the material. So we just zoom out now, you'll see that that's a really interesting effect. And it doesn't just limit itself to these vector textures. So you could use shapes, you could have stars that radiate out, for example, or hearts. But for this particular image, I'm not really looking for this effect. So I can reset the preview, go back into the toolpath. And now we've previewed all these different strategies, I've decided that the one I want to go with is hatch. I'm going to leave it undithered, and we're going to go ahead and calculate that again. And we'll just preview that again, just to make sure I'm happy before we move on to cutting this. And that's great, that's exactly what I'm looking for there. So I'll just put the 3D view back in Z. And for the next part of our Plaque now, we're going to look at some traditional tooling. So I'll just go back over to the 2D view. And the next thing that we're going to look at is the Moulding Toolpath, which will be around the edge of our Plaque here. So to do that, I'm just going to click anywhere on the workspace just to deselect the vectors, because I'm going to want to pick this internal border here, and holding down Shift, I'm going to select this profile here that we're going to use as the cross section for the Moulding Toolpath. Now, if we just have a look at this, I've added this little legging on the end, and that's quite important, but I'll explain that in just a second. And again, for the Moulding Toolpath, we do have a dedicated Moulding Toolpath guide available in the tutorial videos, which we'll add as a related video to this section so you can find it. So I'd highly recommend you go and watch that if you want more information about the Moulding Toolpath. But that can be found under Toolpath Operations on this row here, and we'll just click into that to go into the form. And we'll just give a quick overview of this strategy in this tutorial. So toolpath position, we're going to want that at the very top with no gap above. So it's right at the top of our material. Due to the height of this profile vector that we're using here, it's showing us that we'll be left with a 0.15 inch below the profile in the material. The tool that we're going to be using in this next section of the form is a 1/4 inch ball nose, and we're going to choose to vary the step over. We're going to choose to use an area clearance tool in this case, and for that we're going to use a 1/4 inch end mill. So we'll go into the tool database by clicking select, and we'll select that from the list and click to choose that. The machining allowance just gives us a thin skim of material left behind by the clearance tool, so it can be picked up with the finishing pass, and in this case we're going to leave an allowance of 0.04 inches. We're not going to create sharp corners for this, and with the boundary offset, because I've added this leg onto the bottom of the profile, I'm not going to need to choose to do that. So we'll leave that at 0, and we're not going to choose to create an automatic offset. We can just check over this quickly just to make sure our drive rail is going in the right direction and the profile's looking good. And we can come down and we'll give this a name. So I'll just, for the purposes of this, I'll just call this moulding, and we can click calculate. And you'll see in the toolpath tree, we've now got 2 toolpaths from that. So we've got the clearing pass, and then we've got the finishing pass straight after. So we'll click to preview those visible toolpaths. And once again, we can just take a good look at this in the preview, just to make sure that we're happy with the toolpath before we then go to cut this on the machine. So that's looking great, it's come out exactly how I wanted. So we'll put that back in Z, and we can close out of the preview form. And I'm just going to switch back over now to the drawing tab, because we're going to have a look at the next step in this project. So we'll go to the 2D view, and that will be a V-carving for the text on the plaque. So first of all, I'm going to click to select my kind of placeholder template text, and then we're going to go over to create vectors, and on the third row we're going to go into the draw text tool, and from here we can enter an actual name into the text box. So I'm going to go for William as the first name and click enter to go to the next line, and for the surname I'm going to go for Stone. And with that done, we can close out of the create text tool, and we can instead select our placeholder for the month, day and year. So we'll go back over into the create text, and here I'm going to go for June, And again, clicking enter to go to the next line. And for the day and the year, we're going to go for 18th, 2020. And that's that bit done. So now we've got an actual name and date of birth. So we can look at toolpath in this now by going back over to the toolpaths tab. And as I said, I'm going to go for a VCarving for this text, but we could instead use the laser cut and fill. But I do think a bit of nicely VCarved text will really set this plaque off. So I'll click to go into the VCarve engraving toolpath. And we're going to go for a slight start depth of 0.02 inches. We're not going to use a flat depth because we're just going to cut to the tool geometry so it comes to a sharp point. The tool that we're going to use here is going to be 60 degree 1/4 inch V-bit, so I'll click to select that. We're not going to use clearance tools and we don't need to worry about the rest of the form down here. We don't need any of these options. So we'll just come down and we'll name this name and date. And I'll just make sure that I've got both sets of text selected, and then we can click calculate and then we can preview that toolpath. And that's looking perfect there. And with that done, we can move on to our last toolpath here, which is going to be a cutout path to run around the outside to cut the part out. So I'm just going to close out the preview and I'm going to go back over to the 2D view. And this outer vector here is the one that we're going to use for our cutout pass. And this is actually being created by offsetting this external border vector that we use as the drive rail for the moulding toolpath. So the distance that it was offset was actually from this point on the profile to this point, which is actually 0.35 of an inch. So we'll make sure that we've got the outer vector selected. Just zoom out for a second. And we'll go into the 2D profile toolpath. And our start depth is going to be 0 from the material surface. Our cut depth will be through the material. So if we don't know that, we could put in Z. And we're actually going to cut down a tiny little bit deeper here so we're not leaving any unfinished material. So we'll put Z plus 0.02 and then click equals. And the software will do that calculation for us. We're going to go ahead and choose a 1/4 inch end mill for this. So click select. And it's going to complete that in 6 passes, we can see there. And because it's a cutout profile, we're going to want to cut on the outside of the vector. We don't need to do a separate last pass, and we're going to assume that we've got a safe and appropriate hold down method. So we're not going to add tabs in this case. So maybe in this case, double-sided tape, so we don't need to worry about that in this job. And we don't need to worry about this section of the form, and we don't need to project anything onto a 3D model. So we can come down and just give this a name. So I'll just call that cutout, and we can click calculate. At which point the software will throw up a warning that we're going to be cutting through our material, which we plan to do, so that's fine, we can click OK. And with that calculated, we can then preview the visible toolpath, and you can see that the parts are now being cut away from the material. So with the waste material, so we can just get a better view of this, we can double click on that to delete it, and just take a look around the part that we created. And I think that looks really nice there. So it's a pretty easy layout to edit. So you can put whatever picture you'd like in there, just import it as a bitmap and then apply the toolpaths. Edit the text in the place of the placeholder text. And then you've got a great gift or keepsake, which we've created very easily using a combination of laser and 2D toolpaths. So at this point, you can now go ahead and save out your toolpaths and to the CNC machine. To learn how to do this, please refer to the dedicated toolpath saving guide tutorial that you can find in the related video section on this page. And the only thing left for us to do here is to save this part away. So we'll go to File, Save As, and we'll name this photoplaque_toolpaths. And we'll save that in the project folder, ready for access at a later point.